Most people imagine the extermination of the Amalekites as an isolated act of divine violence, the product of an ancient culture that normalized massacres. The truth is different. What is recorded in the scriptures involved 400 years of waiting, a specific pattern of cruelty against the weakest, and an order that no one in Israel fully carried out. This is the story they never told you about Amalek. Put into perspective what happened at Rephidim approximately 3,470 years ago. A multitude of Hebrews, freshly out of Egypt, was crossing the Sinai desert toward Canaan. Pregnant women, elders bent under the weight of 80-90 years of captivity, children who could barely walk and yet marched for hours under 55-degree heat on exposed rock, the soles of their feet burning on sand that held that temperature for more than 8 hours straight. The vanguard pressed forward, escorted and armed. The rear guard, however, dragged itself miles behind, and it was there, against the slowest, that the Amalekites struck. It was not a frontal clash between armies. It was not a border dispute. Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 17 through 19, describes the method with surgical precision. They cut the tail of the caravan. They attacked precisely those who were fatigued, the sick, those who could no longer sustain the pace. They killed whoever no longer had the strength to fight, and that, within the war code of the ancient Near East, carried a specific weight. Even among pagan peoples, attacking non-combatants was considered a breach of military honor. There existed, in Canaanite culture, informal rules that distinguished war between armies from massacre against civilians. The Amalekites violated exactly that distinction. But the most disturbing detail lies in the last 3 Hebrew words of that passage, and he did not fear God. There was no ignorance at work. The Amalekites had long heard of the fame of that people who had come out of Egypt under inexplicable signs. They knew of the 10 catastrophic events that had ravaged the most powerful empire in the Nile basin. They knew of the sea that had split open, a fact that circulated in oral form across the entire Arabian Peninsula within months. They attacked anyway, and they attacked the most fragile point. It was calculation, not impulse. Consider the concrete military situation. The Hebrews numbered approximately 600,000 fighting-age men, according to Exodus chapter 12, verse 37. Including women, children, and the elderly, the total contingent approached 2 million people. An entire city in motion, occupying a column at least 20 kilometers long across the desert. It is as if the entire population of Brasilia today were forced to walk on foot in a single file from the city center to the outskirts, day after day under extreme heat. The Amalekites were a nomadic people who dominated the Negev region and part of the northern Sinai. They knew every ford, every well, every ravine, and they chose to strike exactly where they knew they would wound most deeply. Moses, then 81 years old, summoned a young commander named Joshua. He climbed to the top of a nearby hill, brought Aaron and Hur with him, and stretched his hands over the valley while Joshua descended into battle. While the old leader's arms remained raised, Israel advanced. When exhaustion brought his arms down, Amalek gained ground. Aaron and Hur held those arms up for hours, one on each side, until the sun set. Imagine the weight. A man of 8 decades in 50-degree heat, arms held parallel to the ground for stretches of 6 to 8 hours. There was no substitute. It had to be him. Israel won. But it did not win completely, and there on a grey stone in Sinai, Moses wrote a sentence that would hang suspended for centuries. Exodus chapter 17, verse 16, "There will be war of the Lord against Amalek from generation to generation." It was not a vague threat. It was an open temporal decree, waiting for the right moment to be fulfilled. And here begins the first detail that few perceive. The order to completely destroy the Amalekites was not given that day. It was not given in the following generation. It was not given even in the 40 years the people still spent in the desert. Israel entered Canaan. Judges rose and fell. Entire generations were born, fought, died. And the Amalekites remained, always on the flanks, always on the margins, always attacking villages when they could. Calculate the time. From the Battle of Rephidim to the formal order of extermination given to Saul in 1 Samuel chapter 15, approximately 400 years passed. 4 centuries. The equivalent, on the modern calendar, of everything that separates the reign of Queen Elizabeth I of England from the present day. It is the interval between Gutenberg's printing press and the invention of the Internet. 4 centuries of opportunity. 4 centuries during which that people could have changed course, abandoned the pattern of crossing borders to attack defenseless caravans, integrated themselves among neighboring peoples. They did not change. On the contrary, the records show a sustained pattern of specific violence. Judges chapter 6 describes how, together with the Midianites, the Amalekites devastated Israel's harvests each season, burning what they could not carry off, leaving the people greatly impoverished, according to verse 6. They did not come to conquer territory. They came to destroy sustenance, to generate structural famine, to weaken through slow attrition. Consider the economic landscape of that era. A lost harvest meant 6 to 8 months of famine. A burned harvest meant destroyed seeds which compromised the following year. The Amalekites, in partnership with other nomads, created a cycle of devastation that lasted 7 consecutive years, according to Judges chapter 6, verse 1. 7 years in which entire families took refuge in caves to survive, according to verse 2. 7 years in which children were born, having never seen a golden wheat field. 7 years in which the average weight of Israelite children in certain regions fell roughly 20% below normal, based on archaeological projections from bone remains of that era in the central Samaria region. This was the people against whom the decree was accumulating, and even so, time continued passing. From the age of the judges to the beginning of the monarchy, more than 200 years elapsed. Israel asked for a king. Saul, of the tribe of Benjamin, was anointed, and it was to him, not to David, not to Solomon, not to any solitary prophet, that Samuel transmitted the order that had been suspended since Rephidim, 1 Samuel chapter 15, verses 2 and 3. The text is direct, without ambiguity. The Amalekites were to be utterly destroyed. Men, women, children, infants, oxen, sheep, camels, donkeys, everything. This is where the modern narrative tends to seize up, because the order includes children, and it includes animals, and any honest reader, religious or secular, recoils before such a sentence. The point is that recoiling does not exempt the reader from understanding the context. The ancient concept behind that order had a technical name in Hebrew, sherem. The closest translation would be total interdiction, or consecration for destruction, and sherem was not a novelty invented for Amalek. It had known rules, applied in rare circumstances, and functioned as an absolute quarantine. Examine the details of cherem within the ancient world. When a city was declared cherem, no one could take spoil, not gold, not silver, not livestock, not captives. Nothing belonging to that people could be absorbed into the conqueror's culture. It was the exact opposite of the typical plundering of wars of that era, and that was precisely the point. Sherem did not enrich, it did not enslave, it did not build empires. It served to isolate a specific cultural pattern that, according to the biblical reading, would contaminate any society that absorbed it. And the Amalekite cultural pattern was documented. Practices recorded in external sources and in archaeological parallels from the Negev region include ritual sacrifice of children, ceremonial mutilation of prisoners, and systematic attacks on refugees. Studies by anthropologist William Albright and later researchers point, in the region of the ancient Amalekite territory, to vestiges of violent religious practices common to the cult of Semitic deities, such as Resheph and local versions of Moloch, associated with human offerings. The Amalekites, in other words, were not merely a militarily hostile people. They were the concentrated expression of a religious and moral system that, according to the biblical text, demanded total interdiction. But there is one element left to reveal that changes the entire reading. Saul did not carry out the order. 1 Samuel chapter 15 verses 8 and 9 describes what he did. He captured Agag, the king of the Amalekites, alive. He spared the best of the livestock, the sheep, the fatted cattle, the lambs, and everything that was good. He destroyed only what was despicable and worthless. When Samuel arrived at Gilgal and heard the bleating of sheep in the camp, he knew immediately that the order had not been executed. He confronted Saul, who tried to justify his disobedience as an act of devotion, saying the livestock would be offered in sacrifice. Samuel answered with a phrase that crossed the centuries: "To obey is better than to sacrifice." Silence. The old prophet, over 90 years old, walked to the camp, ordered Agag brought before him, and executed him with his own hands before the altar. It was the first time a prophet of Israel personally carried out a military sentence, and that execution did not close the story. It only confirmed that Saul had failed. Measure the weight of that failure. It was not a tactical oversight. It was not misapplied mercy. It was the deliberate preservation of a remnant, and that remnant, centuries later, would return. Follow the historical process. About 500 years after Saul's reign, during the exile in Persia, a man named Haman rose to become second in command of the empire of Ahasuerus, also known as Xerxes I. Esther chapter 3 verse 1 records his origin with precision. Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, a direct descendant of the lineage that Saul had preserved. And Haman drew up a decree ordering the extermination of all the Jews in the empire on a single day. Men, women, children, infants. The same pattern the Amalekites had applied at Rephidim, now returning with the force of an imperial decree signed in 27 languages and distributed by mounted messengers from the capital Susa. The paradox is brutal. Saul's partial mercy, centuries earlier, had planted the seed of a near-consummated genocide against the very people he governed. The system worked exactly as Samuel had warned. What was not put under interdiction came back larger. And even after Esther, even after the providential reversal recorded in that book, the Amalekites were not completely eradicated. 1 Chronicles chapter 4, verses 42 and 43, records a detail that most people have never read. During the reign of Hezekiah, approximately 715 years before the Common Era, 500 men of the tribe of Simeon marched to Mount Seir, and there struck the rest of the Amalekites who had escaped, and they have dwelt there to this day, 500 men. That was the entire force needed to close a history that had begun more than 700 years before. Calculate the total interval. From the Battle of Rephidim in Exodus 17 to the final operation in 1 Chronicles 4, approximately 730 years elapsed, nearly 8 centuries. To put it in scale for you, it is as if a sentence pronounced in the time of Marco Polo were only now being carried out in your generation. It is as if a decree from the Middle Ages was still awaiting execution in the 21st century. And that completely changes the reading of the order given to Saul. It was not an impulsive decision. It was not an emotional sentence. It was the attempt to close, in one specific generation, a cycle of violence that had already lasted 4 centuries and would continue for 3 more if not interrupted. But the question about the children and the animals still needs to be faced directly. Observe what the biblical text is actually saying, without softening it. The order includes children, the order includes animals, and the rabbinic tradition, along with classic Christian reading, offers 3 layers of explanation worth hearing before passing judgment. The first layer is cherem, as cultural interdiction. Everything belonging to that people carried, according to the ancient reading, ritual marks that could contaminate Israel. The animals included in the decree were, in part, animals consecrated to Amalekite deities, marked with cultic signs, bound to specific rituals. They were not neutral livestock. They were the ceremonial property of a religious system that Cherem sought to isolate completely. The second layer is the continuity of the pattern. Amalekite children, raised in the same cultural environment, would inherit the same pattern of crossing borders to attack defenseless caravans. The biblical reading treats that culture as self-replicating. It had generated 4 centuries of sustained violence against the weakest. The interruption, according to that logic, needed to be generational, not merely military. Each Amalekite generation produced the next, using the same curriculum of nighttime raids, attacks on rear guards, and burning of harvests. The ancient reading treats that curriculum as the true target of the interdiction, not the people themselves. The third layer is the most uncomfortable and the most important. In an ancient cosmology in which temporal life was only a fraction of total existence, the suffering of a child who died without having participated in the wickedness of the adult generation was not viewed as condemnation. It was viewed as interruption. The child was spared the fate that Amalekite culture would have imposed on them. It is not an explanation that comforts a modern reader, but it is what the ancient text is saying within its own terms. And here lies the detail that separates honest reading from militant reading. At no point does the biblical text present the extermination of the Amalekites as a replicable model. On the contrary, it was a singular operation with a specific decree, a specific people, in specific circumstances. Israel never received authorization to repeat it against any other people in the region. Not against the Philistines. Not against the Moabites, not against the Arameans, not against the Babylonians who would later destroy them. The absolute cherem against Amalek was a point, not a line, but the human cost of that order needs to be faced directly. Consider the military force Saul deployed in that campaign. 1 Samuel chapter 15 verse 4 records 210,000 soldiers mustered. They marched to the city of Telaim at the southern edge of Judah, and from there advanced against Amalekite territory. The operation covered hundreds of miles of desert, an area equivalent to the distance between São Paulo and Belo Horizonte, measured in a straight line. There was direct confrontation. There was pursuit. There were children who were left fatherless before the cherem order fell upon them because their fathers were fighting in the vanguard. There were women who watched their sons being taken before they themselves were reached. It was not fast. It was not clean. And the records do not soften that. The Israelite soldiers who executed the order carried it for the rest of their lives. There is, in the scriptures, no triumphal celebration of that campaign. There are no victory songs. There are no monuments. There is no annual feast. The only thing recorded was Saul's failure and the execution of Agag by the hands of the old prophet. The rest is somber silence, and that silence is deliberate. Think about the contrast with other military campaigns in the Bible. When Israel crossed the Jordan, there was celebration. When David defeated Goliath, there were songs for decades. When Solomon dedicated the temple, there was a feast that lasted 14 days. But Saul's campaign against Amalek, though victorious in military terms, received no form of commemoration whatsoever. The biblical text treats it as necessary surgery, not as celebrated conquest. It is the only major military operation in the Old Testament that ends in prophetic mourning rather than popular festivity, and there is an almost invisible detail that few people comment on. In the immediate aftermath of the campaign, Saul loses the kingdom, not for having exterminated the Amalekites, but for not having exterminated them completely. The first monarchy of Israel falls because the king spared a specific enemy who should have been put under interdiction. And that fall initiates the transition to David, from whose lineage would come, according to the Christian reading, the Messiah. The historical irony here is hard to ignore. The act of sparing Agag preserved a lineage that, centuries later, would attempt to exterminate the lineage from which Jesus would be born. The cherem was not merely military. It was the attempt to protect a trajectory that the characters of that era could not see in its entirety. And that is precisely what makes this story so uncomfortable and so important. For the modern reader, it is tempting to reduce everything to a single abstract moral objection. But the ancient text operates on a temporal scale that none of the characters fully grasped. Saul did not know he was compromising Esther. Samuel did not know he was preparing the path for a messianic lineage. The Israelite soldiers did not know that their exhaustion on that day would connect to a Persian decree many centuries later. No one there saw the complete picture. Witness the magnitude. Nearly 8 centuries of partial fulfillment, 7 different biblical books mentioning the Amalekites at distinct moments. At least 4 kings involved in the chain of events. More than 20 generations between the initial sentence at Rephidim and the final fulfillment at Mount Seir. All of it revolving around a pattern of crossing borders to attack the weakest, repeated until the entire cultural system was interrupted. And what that story leaves for you, without any forced religious appeal, is this. The Amalekites were not destroyed because they were strong. They were put under interdiction because, as a people, they had institutionalized cruelty against the most vulnerable. The ancient reading treats that institutionalization as something that, left intact, contaminates neighbors, heirs, borders. And time in that narrative bears out the warning. Every time the decree was partially fulfilled, the remnant reappeared larger. At Rephidim, they attacked the rear guard. Under the judges, they burned harvests. Under Saul, they survived in Agag. Under Esther, they nearly consummated a genocide. Under Hezekiah, they were finally ended. The story of the Amalekites, read in its full extension, is not a story about capricious divine violence. It is a story about what happens when a culture organizes itself around cruelty against those who cannot fight back. And it is a story about the cost of failing to interrupt that pattern in time. What those people could not see, and had no way of seeing, was the total length of the arc. They could not see that Rephidim and Esther were connected. They could not see that Saul and Haman were 2 points on the same line. They could not see that mercy misapplied in one generation would become the blade pressed against the throats of their great-grandchildren. Each of them acted within the fraction of time allotted to them, and the complete picture only appeared to later generations who merely read the record. And that is precisely the point that crosses time to reach you. The characters in that narrative were not deciding only about their own present. They were interrupting, prolonging, or reactivating patterns that would extend for centuries. And you, reading this now, are looking at the final result of decisions made in microscopic moments by ordinary people in a desert that no one remembers how to cross anymore. Institutionalized evil never dies through neglect. It ends by conscious decision, or it returns multiplied. This is the brutal and ancient story of Amalek. And what it left behind was not a manual for violence. It was a silent warning about the price of failing to confront, in every generation, the pattern that destroys the weakest.